If I had to make one video before I died, one thing to communicate to the world that I thought was important or useful, what I think I can bring to the conversation that will be helpful to everyone who's trying to figure out the big picture questions. What can we know? All the philosophy 101, essentially. People who don't want to know bullshit and want just the answers and want to have a way of thinking that is clear and makes sense. I think I can offer a structure that might be helpful. And this video will be my attempt at showing what I've been able to figure out so far. So what I know is that everything, all things you could possibly know, fall under the umbrella of subjective experience. There is no escaping that. Everything that there is subjective experience. It encompasses all things that are knowable and relevant. And what is subjective experience? I think that it can be thought of as your sensations, feeling hungry, feeling emotions, feeling, and those sensations also include your five senses, what you see, what you hear, and your brain sort of puts together your sensations and creates perceptions about the external world. So sensations are more about the internal world. Perceptions are about the external world. Sensations are direct and you can know them with absolute certainty. Nobody can tell you otherwise. If you're feeling pain, you are feeling pain and there's no discussion. Whereas perceptions, you can be fooled by optical illusions. You think you're walking down a street, but it's a virtual reality, or you're dreaming, but it's still somewhat direct. And so what I think reality is ultimately is your sensations. And our perceptions are, in a way, kind of a model of reality. So this ontology of what is and what's reality is the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. So I'm going to do field of philosophy. And, our sensations give us the ability to make distinctions or to distinguish things. And, our perceptions are things that are defined, that have demarcations. And so what we would call reality in the model, I would say, is a functional abstraction. And, being able to distinguish things correctly, being able to define things usefully, I would call that, an optimal application. And, the scientific reduction of metaphysics, you could simply say is signal input. Our sensations, our five senses are signal inputs. So where do we go from there? That encompasses everything, right? Well, sort of. If patterns are recognized, if we can, the next level essentially is, this is limited to kind of the present. So sensations only occur in what we consider to be sentient beings. So sentient means the capacity to have sensations. It's limited to the present. So if we want to know the future, we need to employ rationality. So We have no direct access to the past or to the future. We can remember and we can predict. So those are functions of inference. So we make observations that are direct, and we can make an inference from them. Inference. And observations are basically sensations and perceptions. If we observe, what we see outside ourselves, inferences are essentially more than just predictions, but the whole reason why we use them and why they matter is the whole point is to make predictions. Even remembering the past, remembering past patterns so we can extrapolate. What we observe are consequences. The consequences to us, to reality, to our sensations. That's what really matters. And these fall under, so consequences and predictions are the functional abstraction. Observations and inferences are our subjective experience. Both of these are still in subjective experience. And the field of philosophy dealing with this is epistemology. Knowing how we know anything, beyond the self. The optimal application would be, evidence for observations and, logic for inferences. And, logic fuels hypotheses. And, evidence is basically the result of tests against hypotheses. And the scientific reduction for these is, if you were to look at a computer and a computer is making inferences based on signal inputs, they would call it a weighted induction. It's a signal induction, and it's weighted against, the network of information. So then what's next after this? Well, if we were just a computer, we'd only be in this blue box here. But because we have sensations, which are, computers don't have, we have sensations because we're animals, and we have feelings, essentially. And those feelings, our emotions, function to move us. So it's sort of like an output, but it's an output towards something. We experience, in the most general terms, preferences. It's a sensation, and what we build from our inferences and perceptions are opinions, and that moves us to make selections from our options, perceived options. This is, I will put voluntary output. We can pick a lot of names here. Some people put ethics in this category. Value theory, I think, is more appropriate, but ethics or aesthetics is the philosophy of value, why we value things, what makes things beautiful. And it's limited to the individual. It's on the individual level. So we have, capacities here, sentience, rationality, and then, levels of analysis. And this level of analysis is at the singular or individual level. And what should go here? Well, we're talking about an intentional agent, something that can move with intention, that feels intention. Optimal application you know, if we have all of our preferences, we make all the perfect selections, we end up with wealth. That's a wealth of, it's not just restricted to material gain, wealth in all dimensions. Um, and if we have all the correct opinions and we know all of our best options, we use the best logic, I mean, that is essentially wisdom. That's the whole goal of philosophy, love of wisdom. Yeah, so all of this so far is still limited at the individual level. So what's higher than the individual level? Well, we live in a community of sentient rational agents that have the capacity to interact. So what's optimal interaction? Well, ethics deals with that. It essentially puts constraints on what's optimal or suboptimal for interaction. So interactive constraints. The only reason why this even matters is because we basically, here I need to pause recording for a second. Okay, I'm able to resume recording now. Ethics only comes into play if this intentional agent has the capacity for empathy, or experiences empathy, meaning they can have sensations that somewhat correspond to the other intentional agent's sensations, and that their actions affect each other and can set a precedent for future interactions. So we'll call this reciprocity. So you kind of need both. Even if you didn't feel empathy, you still have to acknowledge the reciprocal aspect of a relationship. Now, what is the functional abstraction of utilizing these? The principles really of consent, and you can't have consent unless you know where the ownership demarcations lie. So, my body, my choice, my, that type of is what that's alluding to. I could have said that a little more clearly, but basically the optimal application, if you're respecting everyone's consent, it results in liberty and a respecting of property rights. What property is what you own. Basically, if you empathize with someone, you want them to have liberty and you don't want anything to be done to them without their consent. If you understand the optimal reciprocal situations, you would realize that if somebody had property, that you'd want them to have exclusive rights and access and veto power over what eventually happens to their property. And what I'm going to do here is to illustrate why these are optimal. I'm going to do the suboptimal. So against liberty is coercion or force, and violations against property, ultimately because property is what someone has title to in imaginary terms, because property rights aren't a law of the universe per se. There's something we all agree upon and what we think is right based on previous events. The only way to steal is really to claim falsely, to in a fraudulent way, or make a deception over who really owns what. So I mean, all theft is a violation of, you're basically claiming ownership of something you don't own. And the opposite of wisdom is foolishness. Opposite of wealth is poverty. These are all the things we're trying to avoid. If something doesn't have evidence, it's unsupported. We don't want to base knowledge on things that are unsupported or fallacious. If it just doesn't fit logically, then it won't be helpful to us. It's what we've learned. And even the terms we use, if they're not clearly defined, they're vague. And if we can't make proper distinguishing, valid distinctions between real categories of things, ambiguity is harmful when we're trying to make something make sense. So I forgot to write here that this is where we're dealing with groups of others. So, okay, capacity and level of analysis. What should we put here? I mean, the name for that is any locomotive system, really. Something that moves. So, okay, we got, I think, the most important stuff here, this most important foundation. And what it boils down to in practice is what I'm going to go through next. So everything we're doing now is language. How I was saying subjective experience encompasses everything. Well, everything I'm talking about, because I'm talking and because I'm talking to somebody, we're participating in a language game. So how do we measure the language game utility here? So, what we want is to identify what things fall under which categories. So since this has to deal with action, I'm going to put prescriptions and I'm going to contrast that with the other side where it's descriptions of facts. So we want our descriptions, accurate. And we want our values are what tell us what's relevant. Relevance helps us prioritize or aim. Facts help us identify and navigate. That's the whole point of the language game. The game is increase accuracy, make prescriptions with clear descriptions that help us navigate properly to the things that are priority to us. Only reason why any of us ever move at all is due to emotion, sentiment. But without, reason or cognition, we have nowhere to go to. We don't even have a set to select from. So it's somewhat of a prerequisite activity. Basically what we want is, what we care about is what interests us. We want to have an understanding. And if we can explain something, we can demonstrate it, then we can move to understanding. So basically, we're not going to do anything unless you care. And you can't care about what you don't know. So what does this all eventually move toward? Macro activity. Even thought is just simulated activity. So behavior, movement. But before you can move voluntarily, or I should say make a choice or a decision, you have to have some level of comprehension. And what really helps us comprehend things is by communicating. The ability to communicate externally helps us comprehend things internally. All communication is subject to interpretation. Really, all observations as well. You know, and I'm going to put down here, this is conscious and unconscious activity. And all consciousness is data processing. I mean, so what is the mind doing when it's performing cognition or making descriptions? It's a representation. It's what the mind does. All thinking is representation. And you know, that alone won't move you anywhere. That's just drawing the map. To move along the map, you need a destination, you need a will. Will can only, you need emotion or a heart. You need a feeling. If you don't feel anything, you're as good as dead. You're a computer that has storage of data and nothing else. What makes us alive is that we have feeling. And that's conscious activity, thinking and feeling. Will and representation. As you can see that there's some sort of a color scheme going on here, a lot of red and blue, a little bit of purple. You may wonder what the heck's going on with that. There is a method to the madness, so I'm going to give you the legend here. Red and blue legend. Basically, what's red is what's detectable. You know, it gives us our given complexity. You know, it's direct. It's actual. And it's particular. You know, and you could use this legend and look at everything I just wrote here so far, and it should help you understand that this definition of red applies to all the red that's up here. And then by contrast, what's blue is what's measurable. Maybe not scientifically, but even more broadly than that, and measurable in any sense. And that serves to simplify. You know, and by contrast, it's not given, it's a reflection. By contrast, it's indirect. And it's not actual, it's actually theoretical. Imaginary. And this imagination gives us universal application. It's because we've abstracted the commonalities of an object. So now I'm going to go a little off the deep end if I'm not off the deep end already. We can have a scientific frame. Scientific content, and then we can have philosophical frame. And philosophical content. So in the scientific frame, I would say that what's direct and given is duration or time. All events. And what we measure and what's indirect is space, extension. Like Descartes said that there's thinking things and there's extended things. Well, it's really duration things and extension things. And in the content of all of science, we're really only dealing with energy, motion, gravity, and then information, which at the very bottom level, there's quantum fields and there's waves in that quantum field. And that makes up all the subatomic particles that make up all atoms, which make up all molecules, which make up all organisms, which make up us. What about the philosophical frame? In the broadest terms, what's direct is being, or existence. The patterns that exist. And what we extrapolate from that, what we infer from that is what we perceive are the things that are, in contrast to being, is seeming. Essence of things, definitions we ascribe. What we extrapolate. And there's a whole existential versus essential philosophical debate, which precedes what? Well, to me, in epistemology, essence precedes existence, but in metaphysics, existence precedes essence. Anyone could argue with me about that. It's still completely undecided as far as I'm concerned. Might even be a false dichotomy. And what about philosophical content? Here is where I'm getting a little less specific and clear, but I think, I've been reading a lot of Jordan Peterson, so I would put chaos, potential, where there's all opportunities and risks. I'll just put chaos and potential there, where being is essentially, and we make order from it. We have degrees of confidence, and there's probability. It's the broadest terms. So we have a scientific reduction up here. What about a philosophical reduction? What is it in the simplest terms possible? Power and control, essentially. Control is through structure, and power is our basis for anything and everything. No power, no movement, no control, no direction. And this even extends all the way out to economics. So we have, problem, so consumer demand, then we have solutions, supply. Yeah, so these are, it's somewhat of a grid where these are names of what we're looking at, and you can kind of zero in, what subjective experience, what are the two biggest categories of subjective experience and aesthetics, preference and opinions. Then from the red and blue legend, preferences are detectable and direct, and opinions are measurable and theoretical. Scientific, fields of philosophy are basically just objects of attention, scope of consideration. A subjective experience is really the ultimate criterion, the problem of criterion. We experience sensations, and preferences are essentially divided into attractive, what we desire, and aversive, what we fear. And attractive puts us towards a specific thing, and aversive moves us away from a specific thing. Those are the two guiding forces of all movement. Functional abstractions. What are abstractions? It's categorization. Via common characteristics. So, what's common among multiple things, multiply perceived things, we can extract and then treat that, put them in a category. So they're members of a set, essentially. These are the principles and the precedents for optimal application, but optimal towards what? Well, we evolved, we inherited, preferences, and the decision rule for why we have what we have is for cross-generational reproductive fitness. That's what harms us is what harms our reproductive fitness. What makes us happy is what corresponds pretty directly to reproductive fitness. We're happy with family, and when we're healthy, and nobody's getting killed. If we're always, if we're prey and we're being hunted down by predators constantly, that's suboptimal. For slaves to a tyrant, that's not going to help our reproductive fitness whatsoever. That's the source, essentially. Suboptimal against this stated purpose or goal. That it's always implicit, and you can't have any needs or requirements unless you have a purpose or a goal. And what our needs and requirements are based on our wants. And what we want is advantages towards reproductive fitness. And so, intentional agents could be unpacked a little more. It's essentially a centralized and persistent over time, emotive and calculative unit. If people are asking, will AI ever be conscious, or what animals or plants count as intentional agents or are within the scope of moral consideration? If you can feel and think, if you have emotions and you can make calculations, you're an intentional agent. So if you have sentience and rationality at any level, and you can interact with others, you're an individual, essentially, whether you're a computer or a fly. What about a locomotive system? Well, that's really a locomotive system. It's any system that can move on its own. Most systems are networks, and a self-reflective system has feedback loops. I don't remember why I wrote that earlier. So, okay, language game. What are the basics of language games? We have names, which are terms, which are words, which only matter insofar as they reference an object. Objects of attention, objects of consideration. You you can quibble about definitions, but when you're talking, what you're talking about is not the words you're using. You're using the words to talk about the things you're referencing. You know, all of language is a subset of signs, signals. And signals began, I'm stealing from another philosopher, I wish I could remember his name, but he recognized that it starts with an index and then moved on to icon and moved on to symbol and then finally got to sign. So an index is, you see clouds coming and you can make an inference that there's going to be a storm. An icon is a drawing of a storm cloud. A symbol is further abstracted, basically arbitrarily assigned to mean storm cloud. And then all of those function as a sign. Language games are basically sign games. Macro activity, what do words mean? Why do they mean anything? Well, meaning, to quote Wittgenstein, is how they're used. How they're used, implication for action. Action, I mean, we're not going to move planets around. It's going to be within our sphere of influence, which is limited. Maybe that's a good thing. And then all conscious and unconscious activity, all data processing, nuances built in. Scientific content, we all know. Physics, further narrowed to chemistry, further narrowed to biology, further narrowed to neurology, further narrowed to sociology. And then what moves markets? Incentives, incentive structures. We haven't even gotten to politics yet. I think politics is just misunderstood economics, where it really screws up the incentive structures, and is inherently coercive and deceptive, which is why I'm philosophical anarchist. As far as religious opinions and how they fall into this whole frame, Jordan Peterson has a very unique definition of religious that applies to, prior to explicitly expressing things, we perform rituals, which we've abstracted from our behavior, and that religion kind of gives us a map of meaning for moral interaction. But to me, it seems like empathy and reciprocity are the true foundations for moral and ethical behavior. That religion is, that mythological structure may have been necessary to formulate it, but we've reached a point in our human evolution where we can say it explicitly, simplify it, follow these principles without any negative consequence. We could even run it through a computer algorithmically and see that it is optimal. Yeah, this is what I've been able to put together so far. I made a similar video about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, going over the similar topics. I've been creating this from the ground up almost every year for the last 10 years, hopefully getting better as I go along. If this video helps anybody with their philosophy, that would be pretty cool. Feedback's always welcome. Hopefully, I can actually make something of this and it can have a positive impact. But this is, whenever I enter a discussion or a debate or a dialogue, this is where my mind is at. And if somebody says something about emotion, well, my brain goes here and I know that, oh, it's a detectable, direct thing. It's distinct directly against cognition, and it prescribes values. You can't, and a lot of people get these crisscrossed, like, emotional fallacies, in debating hot topic issues like abortion or immigration or all kinds of things. I see people mixing these terms up and mixing the red and blue categories up all over the place. Facts don't care about your feelings. Well, wait a minute. Fact deals with descriptions. Feelings, emotions or sentiment. You need both. One doesn't contrast the other or beat the other. Reason is the slave of sentiment. Per Hume, I don't think there's any escaping that. And talking about emotion without its emotion behavioral consequence is ridiculous. Talking about computers having preferences when there's no basis for that, because preferences are something that are engendered in a biological organism, that were inherited. And how are we going to clearly define those things? It's all really important and interesting. And, people get so caught up in the weeds about so many topics, you know, the abortion issue, for example, consent and ownership. And, is there an obligation to protect the, liberty of the baby, or the ownership or the consent of the mother? The one thing I did want to mention is that, Venn diagrams are basically the best blue way of having clear logic, clearly defined logic. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs seem to be the best way to arbitrate against competing rights, against liberty or consent. If somebody's property rights are being violated because the other person's was starving, that's totally different. I'm starting to become less and less clear as I go on, but it'd be nice if somebody watched this and got something out of it. Thank you for listening.